Sucrose is probably one of the best kept secrets in Genshin Impact. Not only does she have awesome ears, she also is probably the best buffing character in the game, and she can also be one of the strongest DPS caster if built properly. She is often called a budget version of Venti, but with 2+ Constellation, she actually starts to outshine him as one of the most valuable Anemo characters. In this Sucrose character build guide, I will cover Sucrose as a pure support character as well as a DPS caster, which can be done by either providing extra damage and CC potential or purely with a full elemental mastery build. I will also go over her abilities, her talents, and explain the different constellations and power spikes that she gains from them. I will then talk about her stat priority, as well as her best weapons and artifact set choices. Lastly, I will go over some general gameplay tips and team comp suggestions. The way Sucrose works is very similar to Venti. Her abilities will trigger swirl effects when combined with other elements, as well as drag enemies towards the center, which enables for easier AoE and mob control. The difference with Venti is that instead of putting enemies in the air, it stays on the floor, which is arguably better but also has a lot less dragging power, so it doesn't take mobs from half across the room like Venti does. Her abilities scale off her attack, and if built with offensive stat, she also can dish out incredible amounts of damage. The other big part of Sucrose's kit is her elemental mastery buffs that applies a portion of her elemental mastery to the entire party, which then can enable insanely big damage output and is easily one of the best buffs in the game. Her normal/charge attacks is pretty standard, but one thing to note here is that it also triggers Anemo damage, which means you can proc swirl effects simply from auto-attacking, which can be very powerful. Her elemental skill will summon a spirit that will drag monsters into the center and explode, doing a great amount of Anemo damage. Her elemental burst works similarly to her skill, summoning a spirit that drags monsters into the center and damaging them with Anemo damage, and it will do so continuously for 6 seconds. Additionally, if it comes into contact with Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro, it will absorb that element and do extra damage of that type, thus creating extra swirl combos as well. Her first talent makes it so that when she triggers a swirl effect with another element, every party member of that said element will gain 50 elemental mastery for 8 seconds. A very powerful buff that will create a lot more damage than people realize. Her second talent works very similarly. Whenever Sucrose's skill or burst hits an enemy, all party member will gain elemental mastery equal to 20% of what Sucrose has. Note that these do not buff Sucrose herself, sadly, but when used together, you can boost the elemental mastery of your carries by incredibly high amounts and create stupidly high amounts of damage this way. Now for her constellation, the first constellation is amazing. It will grant her elemental skill an additional charge so that it can be casted twice in a row. This is incredibly powerful to both activate her elemental mastery buffing talents as well as doing a lot of damage and reactions. The second constellation extends the duration of her ult by 2 seconds or 33%, which is an amazing buff that can make her ult much more powerful. Getting this constellation makes Sucrose pretty close or even better than a C0 Venti in terms of power and usefulness. The fourth constellation makes it so that every time you perform 7 normal or charge attacks, you will reduce the cooldown of her elemental skill by 1 to 7 seconds. This is absolutely insane for people who use Sucrose to deal damage specifically, as you will be basically spamming your attacks for swirl reaction and get your elemental skills recharging all the time for more insane burst damage. The sixth constellation is an incredible buff when using her ult. Whatever element it absorbs will then cause a 20% damage buff to that element for the entire party during the duration of this ult, which will then cause even more damage of that element. Her stat priority will depend on how you decide to build her. As a damage dealer, you will go for Anemo damage as well as crit rate and crit damage, while attack and elemental mastery will also be valuable in that scenario. In that case, you would try to itemize as follow: attack or elemental mastery on the sands, Anemo damage on the goblet, and crit rate or crit damage on the circlet. As a support, you would try and aim for elemental mastery and energy recharge as priorities to enhance her buffing capabilities and her ult uptime. Because she still does very good damage even as a support, you can also use her with offensive stats here and do very well. This will depend on how you use her. If you're simply trying to make a Sucrose that buffs for elemental mastery, or if you're trying to do a reaction slash damage support, all these stats will actually work very well, and it will depend on how you do so, but there is very hardly any ways to go wrong here. In that case, you would try to itemize as follow: energy recharge or elemental mastery on the sands, Anemo damage or elemental mastery on the goblet, and elemental mastery or crit rate and crit damage on the circlet. As for the weapons, there are a lot of good options out there for Sucrose, and depending on your build and constellation, some will be better than others, but almost every single one of these weapons is amazing for her, and you will hardly go wrong here. Sacrificial Fragments is probably one of her best weapon choices that you can get from the gacha. It provides elemental mastery as a substat, which can be great especially when using her as a support, and its effect will allow your elemental skill to have a chance of resetting its own cooldown. This weapon becomes even better the more refinement level it has, but when you have Constellation 1 and 4 specifically, you will be using the elemental skill a lot, and this will become even better. Mapamare is another great option with elemental mastery and available for free-to-play players because it is craftable. The effect is also very good to increase her damage output even as a support. Lost Prayer, Solar Peril, the Witsit, and even Black Cliff Amulet are also all amazing options if going for a damage-oriented build, as they all provide crit rate or crit damage, which is one of the best offensive stats in the game, as well as all of their effects are really amazing for her when being built as a damage dealer. Thrilling Tales of the Dragon Slayer is also another very powerful option. Being a 3-star that you can refine very easily, you will be giving a 48% attack buff to one of your party members, which goes hand in hand with her already great buffing capabilities. As far as artifact sets are concerned, the 4-piece Viridescent Veneer is by far one of her best options, as this set is insanely busted for both supporting by reducing elemental resistance of enemies, as well as for dealing damage by buffing both Anemo and swirl damage. This set alone can increase the damage of Sucrose and her entire party by huge amounts, anywhere from 20% to 300% damage, due to the elemental resistance reduction alone, and is a must on most Anemo characters. We have an entire video on our channel about this artifact set and the math behind why it's so amazing. If you're interested, check it out. It will be in the description below. In the early game, you can also go with 4-piece Instructor, which is a very powerful option, though sadly Instructor does not have a 5-star version and will have to be replaced in the late game for optimal power. 2-piece Wanderer's Troop as well as 2-piece Instructor can also be mixed together for a very powerful additional 160 elemental mastery, and you can also mix and match with Exile or Scholar for energy recharge. Now for team comps and gameplay tips on how to play Sucrose, I would say Sucrose is probably one of the best Anemo support in the game, often compared to Venti, who is a 5-star, but the problem with Venti is that in the later levels of the Abyss, when there are a lot of bigger monsters who are immune to the pull effect of his ult, he loses a lot of his value and is a lot harder to consistently trigger his swirl effects and take advantage of that ult. Meanwhile, Sucrose's ability and auto attacks all trigger swirl quite easily, as well as stays on the floor, which keeps mobs on the floor and accessible by all other characters, making her slightly superior to Venti in some situations, as well as easier to use for some players. The great thing about Sucrose is that she can be paired extremely well with any Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro users, as the ult synergize very well with all these elements. The only character that she would not pair very well are the ones who do not utilize their elements a lot, for example, heavy physical DPS build character. When using Sucrose, you have to make sure you understand how elemental mastery works so that you can utilize her buff to the optimal capability. Elemental mastery only works on the character whose element triggers the elemental reaction. So for example, if a mob is applied by fire and then you use a character's Hydro to trigger a vaporized reaction, that character who has triggered the Hydro reaction will be the one whose elemental mastery stat is going to be used to calculate the damage. This works the same with all elements, and even if the characters is not out in the field, so just make sure that you are triggering reactions with the correct characters when using Sucrose as an elemental mastery buffer. I hope you enjoyed this guide. Let me know your opinion of Sucrose and how you use her in your team, as I know there are many more great and interesting builds for her that I might have not covered here. I hope that you can check out some of the other character guides that we have already done in the description below, as well as come check out our daily live streams where we answer all of your questions. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.